So the second period of the Baroque that we're going to look at is the most typical, the one with the qualities most often associated with those that you saw in the first video you looked at, how to recognize Baroque art in Module 1. This is the High Baroque. You see the dates right here. Historians suggest that the reason why there is such a exuberance to the art, a theatricality to the art that is different from those early reform periods, is because the wars of, the Protestant versus the Catholic religions have kind of been at it for, fighting for territory in Europe and elsewhere in the missionary areas for now decades. The wars of religion tend to end in 1648. That's when a treaty is signed, and it's clear now on the map of Europe, like which countries are Protestant and which are Catholic. And the Catholic ones include France. France was teetering on the edge, whether to be Catholic or Protestant. Spain, clearly Catholic, and Italy obviously Catholic as well. So as that is all being settled by the wars, the Catholic powers think of themselves as triumphant. This High Baroque period is thought of as a moment of the triumph of the Catholic Church. Their triumph comes about not only because they've gained territory in Europe or settled their territory in Europe and they've got the wealthier countries behind them, but also because of missionary work by certain religious orders, including the Jesuit order. We'll talk about that in a second. In Asia, in the Americas, less so, only in smaller parts of Africa. In any event, in terms of art, this period is dominated by sculpture, or maybe more appropriately, installation art, sort of art that encompasses you in a three-dimensional way. And it is dominated by this guy, Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini. You can see his dates there. Who has a very large workshop. So he's kind of in the old school. He's not teaching pupils so much as he is just training them. But he lives such a long time and dominates the field that that in some ways we only know his name. His name is attached to the works that come out of his large workshop. You can read the textbook a bit about the nature of the creation of works of art of sculptural works of art in this period. So I'm going to show you a few of Bernini's works. This one you've already seen. It's the David, the Old Testament David, who's fighting, throwing a rock towards Goliath and slaying him, the great underdog. And you can read about this more in the textbook, and you've seen him before in the first video. Again, remember the diagonals, the energy, the emotional accessibility, the fact that this is an involving sculpture, that you have to walk around it to make sense of it. Now, Bernini did that sculpture of David for one of his great early patrons, this guy, Cardinals wear that kind of hat sometimes, Scipione Borghese, Big Skippy Borghese, who was a nephew to one of the popes, and to be this is one of the great examples of nepotism. If you were related to somebody in a high office, like the papacy, you could also have a position of power and wealth. And nepotism kind of got wiped out after this Baroque period, but I think a good example is, Ivanka Trump and her husband in the White House of the President Trump. You will hear the word nepotism used to describe that as well. But in any event, a very wealthy man. Bernini did a speaking likeness of him, a bust. So a bust is just a statue, kind of cribbed, if you will, from the ancients. It was just a likeness, a portrait from the waist up, sometimes from the shoulders up, But Bernini was really good at creating what's called a speaking likeness, as if the figure is alive in the moment that they are speaking. And Bernini did preparatory drawings in order to get that Baroque snapshot of a moment in time. He's a really great sketcher. But please, again, check out the textbook on how sculpture is made. There are often, again, these preparatory drawings, getting all the angles right, and then sometimes a creation of a little statue in clay that then is converted into a larger marble statue. A second work that Bernini did for Cardinal Scipione Borghese is this, the Apollo and Daphne. Again, you can read about it in the textbook. This is Apollo, obviously, and Daphne. The story is a pagan myth taken from this textbook by an ancient Roman poet called Ovid. It's called the book is called the Metamorphoses, a story of great transformations, in this case where Daphne is transforming into a tree. And you can see it here. Bernini is, look at her toes, or you see roots, her body is being encased by bark, etc. Check up here with her fingertips and her hair. And the reason why she is asked to be transformed into a laurel tree, which we associate always now with Daphne, because she wants to avoid the sexual advances of Apollo. I don't have a Christian moral to explain away the popularity of this subject, but in any event, that is the subject. Okay, let me go down. Stop. So please apply all the adjectives or adjectival phrases you know about the High Baroque, how to recognize the Baroque on this statue. Again, it involves you in the sense that you feel you need to walk around it to really get a sense of it. It's just a little bit over life size. If you see it in person, I mean, I've seen people cry in front of this thing. But again, the bark as it encompasses this terrified woman. Again, all views involving the viewer. And then one more image for good measure. Again, you can see again her fingertips turning into leaves. Now I want to show you two more works of art by Bernini, one in the textbook, one not. And they are in the Church of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is in Rome. It's the major church of the popes. That's where it was one of the first churches established in the early 300s, but highly redecorated over and over again in the Renaissance and the Baroque period. So the history of the church is interesting, but we are just going to look at two Bernini works in it. Please note that the church is what we call longitudinal. That is, if you squint here in the church proper, you can see a cross in the plan. And at the center of the crossing is the first work, the Baldacchino, over the tomb of St. Peter. And the second work is here at what we call the apse. It's the throne of St. Peter. There's a third Bernini work, which is this colonnade that goes outside, that also, very Baroque architecture in the sense that it embraces the viewers who come to St. Peter's. So here we are at the front door, and again, the church itself was actually finished by the early Baroque period. But again, Bernini puts in these two high Baroque, so we're inside, and at the crossing is the Baldacchino, and then you can see through the Baldacchino to that last work, the Cathedra Petri. First work, Baldacchino, or Baldachin. It's essentially a type of umbrella structure that you would a in its real life, not here in this kind of permanent sculptural form, but in its real life, it would be four pillars, a little canopy top, and you'd have four people carry it to cover a really important person in a procession, like, papal procession, a pope walking through town. You'd have a baldachin held over him. In this case, again, it was made more sculpturally permanent and put over the tomb of St. Peter. Now, let me tell you that St. Peter was incredibly important to the Catholics because Peter, they make the case that Peter was the first pope, that Christ told Peter he would run the church. The Protestants did not like the papal power. They did not like the power of the popes and dismissed that story that the Catholics were trying to, reinforce. And so Bernini's monument sort of is helping along this religious slash political message, Catholic message that Peter's power is everything to the popes. I'm going to explain the parts, what's listed here as under iconography or symbolism of the parts of this baldachin. First are these twisty columns. They're called Solomonic columns. They were the columns, they look like the columns that decorated the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed. The Temple of Solomon was a temple created by the Jews and it held, long story, it held the Ark of the Covenant. That is to say, it held objects that suggested the relationship between God and his chosen people, the Jews at this point. It was destroyed, but there was memory of what those columns looked like. And so the Catholics here, now many centuries later, after the destruction of that temple, are using it to suggest that this is, again, part of a covenant that God has with now what they consider the chosen people, the Catholics. It is covered by grapevines. Grapevines are always used in Christian symbolism to suggest the blood of Christ. There's wine in the Christian ceremony that is intended to stand in for the sacrificial blood of Christ. If you look closely, well, we can't see here, but there are bees in the midst of these grapevines. There are also bees up here on kind of these cloth doodads on the horizontal part of this baldachin. That's personal iconography of the Pope in charge of creating this statue or thing, installation. The dates are 1623 to 1636, and Pope Urban VIII Barberini was Pope at that time. The Barberini's coat of arms included the bees, hence the Barberini bees, and you can read about that in the textbook. Also is this three-tiered hat. We'll see this again and again. It's the papal tiara, the papal crown, suggesting the three powers of the Pope. One, power over the hierarchy of the church. Two, power over the armies. The Pope had armies to go fight those wars of religion. And three, a spiritual power. And so in any event, the church wanted to make sure that the Protestants knew they had all three of those powers. And then at the top, this orb and the cross is kind of cut off here in the picture, but again, that the world is governed by, in this case, the Catholic cross. Now, deliberately, Bernini set up the baldachin to frame the next work of art that is dated later, so and done for another pope. And you can see those dates, and you can see the pope. The work of art here, it's this thing here, is the chair of St. Peter, the Cathedra Petri in Latin. Here it is. Underneath this bronze encasing is the real throne of St. Peter. Peter was the first bishop of Rome, and he had a chair to sit in that signified his power. So here it is, just encased in bronze, a relic from the past. Peter lived about 50, 60 AD, and so encased here. Please note that the tiara is up above the chair, and that there are two little angels there that hold two keys, one to loose and one to bind. These are the powers of the Pope, to forgive sins and to not forgive sins, to send people to hell. Also notice the light. The light is obviously the light of God shining down to, enforce those powers of St. Peter. And these guys here, the four fathers of the church, who are commentators on the Bible, for whom the church has, relies to interpret those Bibles for its policies. And very quickly, there's a relief sculpture on the back that shows Christ talking to Peter, telling him, again from the Bible, feed my sheep, which is essentially, again, this message of authority. Peter, take care of my church. Hence, popes take care of my church.